got a best-selling book out, #1 bestseller, 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos. Welcome to the program. I want to talk to you about a few things. And I know I don't want to, get you into politics, just common sense. I don't know if you've been following, for instance, the CNN town hall this week and this debate that we're having. But we have 16-year-olds that are demanding that America pretty much disregards the Second Amendment, and we're not having sensible arguments at all. There's no reason in the debates that we're having. We're not listening to each other. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think that can be. Well, I think that can be. That's true on a much wider scale than merely the debate that's going on about what happened after Parkland. We're not listening to each other at all. We're polarized to a great degree.
So how do we solve this?
Well, I've been recommending, first of all, I would say that in my book, in 12 Rules for Life, in Rule 6, I outlined why such things as the Parkland school shooting occur. And it has very little to do specifically with guns. There's something much deeper and more horrible going on that is rather dreadful to look at. I mean, people who are motivated to do the sorts of things that happened at Parkland they're possessed by a kind of ill will, an evil ill will whose magnitude is difficult to describe. And it's a problem of disorientation and meaninglessness, and it's expressing itself in gun violence, but it can express itself in all sorts of ways. And the deeper problem has to be solved as far as I'm concerned, and that's the problem of nihilism in the face of the tragedy of life. And it's that kind of destructive nihilism that drives the actions of people like the school shooters. So it's very difficult for us to have an intelligent conversation about that, because nobody wants to look at the darkness enough to actually understand what motivates people like the shooters. And it's not surprising, But what happens then, of course, is that the discussion gets politicized, and it goes down the same rails that it's always gone down.
Yeah.
The Democrats say their thing, and the Republicans say their thing, and it never really ends up. The discussion never really ends up being about the school shootings, for example. So,
well, I've been saying all week. I started the week with a monologue on. Nobody even wants to talk about 7 out of the 9 shooters that were under 30 came from fatherless homes.
Right.
I mean, we have a breakdown.
Yeah, there's definitely something there, I would say, because these young men, they lack purpose and direction, and that's really not a good thing, because life is very difficult. As the religious sages have always had it, life is suffering. And you need to set something positive against that suffering, or it corrupts you. And when it corrupts you, you become vengeful and vindictive and murderous and genocidal. Like that, those are the stages. And that the school shooters are 2/3 of the way to genocidal by the time they perform their actions.
Well, how do we?
And it's because they turn against life, because life is so difficult, and they have nothing positive to set against it. It's a real catastrophe. And the fact that we're transforming ourselves into ideologues, both on the right and the left, is a reflection of the same problem, is that because people lack genuine engaged meaning in their own personal lives, in large part because they don't understand how necessary it is to take responsibility, they turn to pseudo-solutions. And an ideology, right or left, is a pseudo-solution to the problem of meaning in life. And it's very dangerous.
How do we find meaning? How do young men find meaning in their life when society is tearing them down and saying, you're bad, you're worthless, you're not needed?
Yeah, well, it's part of an all-out assault, as far as I can tell, in some sense, mostly from the radical left, on the idea of competence itself. And there's a confusion between tyranny and power and competence. In our society, which is a pretty free society, so let's say Western societies, most of our hierarchies are mostly predicated on competence, which means that if you can do the job, you tend to rise in the organization. Now, that's contaminated a little bit with tyranny and power, of course, because no organization is perfect. And what we have is a claim, essentially, from the radical left that male competence is indistinguishable from male tyranny and power, and so that it should be all torn down. Not only the hierarchies, but the spirit that generated the hierarchies. And that's fundamentally the masculine spirit, even symbolically and psychologically speaking. So what we see is an all-out assault on the masculine spirit, and that was actually formalized by Jacques Derrida. He called Western culture phallogocentric, phallo from phallus, and logo from logos. So it was male-dominated and driven by logos, and of course that's the Christian word, and also the root idea behind the word logic. And so it is part of an all-out intellectual and an all-out war of ideas. And the people who are bearing the brunt of that at the moment are, I would say, young men. Yeah, it's really not good.
So what is the end goal? Is it as clear as it seems to be that it is the end goal, and the motivation is just to destroy the West? Can you find any logic in there that is well, if you more buy than that?
If you buy the idea that the West is a corrupt patriarchy, and then that's the logical end goal. I mean, the more radical disciplines at the universities, women's studies and those sorts of disciplines, have said for decades that their goal was the destruction of the patriarchy. It's like it's very often, that people tell you what they're doing. You just have to listen to them. I mean, if you read the school shooters' documents, like the kids from Columbine High School, they told you exactly why they did what they did. If you go onto the websites and read the curricula and the dictates of women's studies disciplines at universities, they tell you exactly what they're doing. If the West is a corrupt patriarchy, then the right thing to do is to tear it down. So it's not a surprise, and it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just precisely that's the doctrine, that's the dogma. And the university, especially the humanities departments, are overwhelmingly left and radical left. That's been well documented by people like Jonathan Haidt with his Heterodox Academy. And Jonathan is an extraordinarily reasonable person. He's no one's idea of a radical.
Yeah. I greatly respect him. Who is, Jordan, who are the people that we should be reading, besides you and your book? Who are the people that inspire you, or it can inspire men to be men?
Well, I think that Steven Pinker is doing a fine job. He has a new book out now. It's in the top 10. So Pinker's a good person to read because Pinker's making a very powerful pro-enlightenment, pro-reason, pro-science, pro-progress case, well documented empirically. I mean, the empirical evidence is pretty clear. Although there is some evidence that inequality is increasing. First of all, no one knows what to do about that, right or left. There's a new book by Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveling, which I would also much recommend it because he analyzes the problem of inequality with dead seriousness and traces it back thousands of years and points out quite clearly that it's a problem, but that it can't be laid at the feet of capitalism. That's just foolish. It's a way deeper problem than that. But despite the fact that there's increasing inequality to some degree in the West, overall the entire world is getting richer, and there are fewer poor people. There are way fewer people in absolute poverty than there were 15 years ago, far fewer. And so what's happening is our economic system is generating a lot of surplus, and it's being quite effectively distributed even to the lowest end of the socioeconomic spectrum, but inequality still remains a problem. And that drives a fair bit of theorizing on the left, but I would very much recommend Scheidel's book, The Great Leveling. It's very bright, and then there's Pinker, and then I'm very much a fan of great classic literature. I'm a great admirer of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's novels, in particular, are unbelievably profound explorations of the role of human responsibility in the face of the tragedy and malevolence of existence. So, and I have a reading list at jordanbpeterson.com that has about 40 books on it that I've recommended. That some of them are psychological in nature and others are literary. Some are philosophical.
Can you describe what we all should be shooting for as a man?
Yes. So I was thinking about an image related to that. So there's a cathedral in Montreal called St. Joseph's Oratorio, and it's built on a hill. It's a very large cathedral, so it overlooks the hill. It's a beautiful building, and then there are many, many steps leading up to it, hundreds of steps, and pilgrims come there to trudge up the steps one at a time towards the cathedral, and there's something deeply symbolic about that. The idea that's being expressed is profound and necessary, and that is that we all need a vision of the way that life in the world could be. We want to have a vision that could be as good as it could be, the least amount of suffering and the most for everyone, and the most freedom for everyone, and the best for everyone. And the question is, how do you approach an ideal like that? And the answer to that is by carrying your burden one step at a time up the hill. And that's what you do in life. You're not a victim. Or if you are, you carry it. And you take responsibility for it. And you're someone other people can rely on. And you tell the truth. And that way you make the world a little better instead of worse. And that's the alternative to ideological possession and collective action and group hatred and tribalism and all those things that tear us apart, is to accept that your life is tragic and that you'll suffer and that there's evil in the world. It's your responsibility to take that onto yourself and to carry it forward towards the good. That's meaning in life. And that's the antidote to chaos and to catastrophe. And the West knows this. This is why we're an individualist culture, because we know that the individual has to be set above the group. But it's not the individual in all his rights. It's the individual in all his responsibility. And that's the part of the dialogue that's missing from our culture currently. And I believe that's why my book has become so popular, and the lectures as well, because I'm telling people, suggesting to people, and particularly, but not only to young men, that they need to accept as much responsibility as they can tolerate, and then build themselves into people who can tolerate even more responsibility. And to accept that gratefully, because that's where the purpose and meaning in life is.
Jordan, I've gone from a man, for a while I rejected that I had changed a great deal in the last couple of years, but I have, and I've gone from a guy that was very popular because I was certain of things, to a guy who now really appreciates doubt and I kind of view certitude as a dangerous thing, because if I'm certain of what I believe, then I don't necessarily believe anybody else has anything to teach me, or
right.
And yet I think this is the message of Christ is humility, and yet.
Well, the humility is that, like, if things aren't everything they should be for you and around you, then clearly you don't know enough.
Correct. But
right? And so then you better be looking for what you don't know, and that's the opposite of certainty.
We are in a situation now that it almost feels like we don't trust that the truth will eventually win, that God is on the side of truth. And so we have to engage in this warfare, and we're engaging online, we're engaging in trial.
1% is the lights and everything. And I said, well, I specified that in my original request. I wanted the whole assembly. I said, the price I quoted you was just for the bare shell. He said, but look, because we already made the deal, I'll honor it. And I thought, that's why our damn civilization works. And I'm really serious. I always hear people talk about natural resources. There's a great book I read a while back called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. Not the Adam Smith version. And I was a speech, I think. Anyways, it doesn't matter. It was written by a Harvard emeritus professor. And he was trying to figure out why some cultures are rich and other cultures are poor. And he did an interesting analysis. He compared Western Hemisphere countries that were settled by Portugal, Spain, and France with Western Hemisphere countries that were settled by England. And what he basically found was that because of the English Commonwealth structure and the traditions that went along with it, if you were settled by England, then you were rich. If you were settled by the other countries, then you tended to be poor. And he tried to boil that down and understand why. His basic conclusion was countries governed by English common law tradition produced individual interactions that were fundamentally predicated on trust, and that's what made people rich. And he also analyzed Japan. And Japan's a very interesting society because they have no natural resources, right? All they have is like rocks and rice. And and the rice they have to subsidize because they don't even really have rice because it's too expensive to grow there. So they really have nothing, but they do have interpersonal trust. Their society is very stable in that regard, and so they're very rich because of that. And so his conclusion, unfortunately I can't remember his name, that might come to me, was that the only genuine natural resource was honesty and trust. And that's really something to think about, man. And I think there's something about that that's deeply, deeply true. So, okay, so back to the idea of meaning. It's like, well, you experience meaning in your life when you move beyond your domain of comfort into the unknown. And you do that because you're courageous enough to take on the burden of your own vulnerability and to expand your confidence despite that. And when you do that, then you're properly engaged with the world and you feel that your existence is worthwhile. And you feel that because you are, in fact, making yourself better in a way that's also making other things better at the same time. And that's a reliable marker. I said, well, what should you have faith in, let's say, in terms of your fundamental axioms? Well, you could start by positing that existence itself is good. You could start by, and you could say, I'm going to act like that. I'm going to act as if that's the case. Obviously, you can dispute that in a serious way, but if you go one way, then one set of consequences emerge, which is, I think, that the world gets better, and if you make the other decision, another set of consequences emerges, which is the world gets worse. So you could say, well, let's act as if being itself is justifiable, and then let's take a further step and act as if our proper role is to accept our own vulnerability and the malevolence of the world and work to eradicate it. And then, so if people, see, that would be my answer to the question whether or not I believe in God. I think that's the right way of answering it. It's like, well, I think that it's proper to act as if being is justifiable, and then our proper role within that being is to do everything we possibly can to make things as good as we can possibly make them. And then that's a faith that's acted out rather than a statement about a set of propositions. Do you believe in God? It's like, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by believe exactly? Are you talking about adherence to a set of articulatable facts? It's like, that's not the deepest form of belief. The deepest form of belief, given my existential meaning, is what you act out. Right? It's what you act out. That's what you believe. And so there's some things to act out. Well, the alternative is to make everything worse. And maybe you think that's justifiable, but it's a bad idea. And that idea also in some sense fills me with hope, because I do believe that the human spirit is in some sense indomitable. And God only knows what we can make of what we've got if we all try to make the very best of it. At the very least, I know that we can stop things from degenerating into the kind of absolutely catastrophic hells that we experienced in the 20th century. And that would be a lovely thing to avoid, even if we can't bring about paradise on earth, right? Even if we can't all work diligently towards the kingdom on the hill. We could make sure that we didn't slip backwards into the sorts of hell that characterized Nazi Germany and the Gulag Archipelago in the Soviet Union. And that would be something. So another axiom of faith for me would be, well, all right, so we're going to accept that being is justifiable, partly by noticing that we actually love people despite their fragility, and so we've already made that judgment in a fundamental way. And we're going to act as if our proper role in life is to take the overwhelming weight of our own being on our shoulders and work to make things better regardless, which is a really noble pursuit, right? You know, because you might think, well, how is it possible, given your current dismal circumstances and wretchedness, that you could possibly have any regard for yourself, any esteem for yourself? I won't use self-esteem because I hate that phrase, but have any regard for yourself. And I would say, well, look, if you know that your fundamental conditions of existence are tragic, with a touch of malevolence just to make things that much worse, and that your eyes are open to that, you understand the catastrophic nature of that, and then despite that, you decide that your job is to wake up in the morning and to put things right, then maybe you could also say, well, you know, I'm not such a bad creature, all things considered, that I can take on that damnable load and still work with every fiber of my being to help myself and everyone else avoid the hell that might otherwise emerge. And so there's something that you can wake up to. And I do think that there's a nobility in that, a genuine nobility. I think it's the kind of nobility that allows you to justify your miserable existence in the world. And that's what you need. You don't need to be happy, because happiness is evanescent. It disappears because things fall apart on you. And if you're happy, good for you, and enjoy it. And I'm like, great. But it's not a boat that will get you through a storm, because as soon as there's a storm, you're not happy. And if happiness is what's keeping you afloat, then you sink. And that's not good, because the storms are always coming. And so what you need is something that will get you through the storm. And the idea that there's something about you that's noble enough to struggle uphill despite your unbearable load, it's like, yes, that's something you can take to the bank, man. And if you act that out in the world, you know, not only will you make your own life better, and that you'll make yourself stronger, and you'll improve your character, but you'll also make things better for your family, and you'll make things better for your society. And so that sense of meaning, this is something that's so cool, and I do also believe that this is true, is that the sense of meaning that orients you in relationship to the known and the unknown, right, also orients you towards the what would you call it, the stacking of different levels of being. So, in order for you to exist properly in the world, you can't just exist for yourself. You have to, because you don't just exist right now, let's say. You exist right now, and you exist next week, and you exist next month, next year. And so you have to act in the moment such that the probability that you will continue to exist and happily, let's say, at all those other time frames also simultaneously exists. So that means that you have to bind your action in the present by the necessity for your continued propagation across time. That's the discovery of the future, something that's very uniquely human. So you have to take into account your future self. And that's not very much different than taking into account other people. And you also have to do that. If you're going to exist now and in the future, you're going to have to exist in a way that makes other people want to exist around you, because otherwise things might fall apart really badly and you're done, you're gone. And so misbehaving in any fundamental way is a bad long-term survival strategy. So you might think, well, to act properly, you have to act properly now, and with regards to the multitude of your future selves. That's something like delay of gratification, I would say, or sacrifice for the future. And you have to act in a way that also benefits your family and that also benefits your community. And I would also say that's the riposte to postmodern nihilism and the claim that there's no such thing as a fundamental narrative. It's like the postmodernist claim is something like the world is so complicated that there's an infinite number of ways you can interpret it. And that actually happens to be true. The world is so complicated, it isn't even obvious how we can see it, technically. Like our vision is a real mystery. But the fact that there's an indefinite number of ways of potentially interpreting the world does not for a moment imply that there's an indefinite number of valid ways of existing in the world. And when you think about the constraints that are put on your existence, then you can see that the proper ways of existing in the world start to shrink to a very, very small range, let's say. I really like the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. I've talked a fair bit about his ideas, and so some of you might have heard some of the things I've said about Piaget before. But what I really like about Piaget, in part, is his analysis of children's games. Children's games are the microcosm of society, which is why children like games, because they have to learn how to act in society. So they generate toy societies, which is what you do when you play video games or go see a movie, by the way. you generate a toy society, and then you practice acting in it. And the toy society has it has the same structure as real society, except at lower resolution. And that's what children are doing. That's why you should leave them the hell alone when they're playing, because they're actually practicing learning how to exist. And so it isn't trivial. The fact that they're enjoying it is beside the point. It's just, that's an indication that they're following the instinctive path of meaning, let's say. And so they're practicing being in the world. And so it would be a good thing, for example, if our schools let children play a lot more than they do let them play. Recess for liability reasons, which is something that's happened almost everywhere, which is so appalling, it's almost unutterable. So Piaget was very interested in what made a good game, and he laid out some rules. A good game is one that you can play iteratively, and that's a good thing to know if you're going to marry someone, because you're going to play the same game every day for like 5,000 iterations, right? So there's a little coda that goes along with that, by the way. It's something to think about too, is, because a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that the exceptional things they do in their life, like the vacations they take and so forth, are the important things in their life. And that's just absolutely not true. The things you do every day are the important things. And so those mundane things, I'll get back to the game thing, but I had a client who was spending about 45 minutes, this is sort of related to Rule 5, which I said I wasn't going to talk about. Don't let your children do anything to make you dislike them. He was spending about 45 minutes a night fighting with his son to try to get him to go to bed. And so I knew that parents actually only spend, on average, about 20 minutes a day with their little kids, like in direct one-on-one contact. They're around them, but direct one-on-one contact, it's vanishing in a small proportion of the time. And so you're spending 45 minutes a night fighting with your kid. It's like, that's twice as much time as you would normally spend with them. And if you think that that's going to end well, then you're not thinking about it. So we thought about it. People don't like it when I do this because people don't like arithmetic. But we did a little bit of arithmetic. So figure 45 minutes a day is about 5 hours a week. Okay? And so that's about 20 hours a month. So that's half a work week a month. And so if you multiply that by 12, then that's 6 work weeks a year, a month and a half of work weeks. So basically, he was spending a month and a half of work weeks a year fighting with his son. It's like, that's not a good game, right? That's not a game anyone's going to win. And so, but it's interesting to do that arithmetic with regards to the things that you repeat every day, because you sort of learn exactly what your life is made of, and your life is made up of those things that you repeat. And so what you want to do is get those mundane things that you repeat pristine, which is why I've got that little trope that you were all laughing about cleaning up your room. It's like, when you live in the damn thing, it's like, why not put it in order? Maybe even go the next step and make it beautiful if you can manage that. And it's just my room. It's like, well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that it's the microcosm of being that you have at hand. And if it's a mess, then it's like, well, what the hell are you up to exactly? You can't even manage that. That's pretty pathetic. And you think, well, it's beneath me. Oh, really, is it? Okay, well, fine. So if someone gives you a whole country to rule, well, you pull up your socks and get your act together and that's it's just your damn way. So back to the game, what Piaget noted with children was that if you're going to set up a good game, then everybody has to want to play it. You have to be able to play it over and over, but everybody has to want to play it. That's the definition of a good game. It's so cool because Piaget was actually trying to reconcile the distinction between science and religion. That was what was driving him throughout his entire intellectual life. And he was trying to understand the evolution of morality. And one of his observations was, well, children spontaneously play, and their games tend towards playable games. And a playable game is one where everyone is treated with a certain amount of respect as a valid player, and everyone actually wants to play the game, so it's voluntary. And that's a really good definition of a free society. It's like, well, you get to play, and you get to play, and you both want to play, and if it's set up, you can't think of a better game, and so away you go. And so that's another indication of the fact that there's something about a fundamental ethic that isn't just arbitrary. And this is a very important thing to get right, I would say, in the 21st century, because one of the things that we kept claiming in the 20th century was that any old arbitrary game will do. They're all equally arbitrary. It doesn't matter if they're Marxist or capitalist. It's all equally arbitrary. It's like, no, that's wrong. That's seriously wrong. The scientific data are in. The philosophical data are in. The narrative is in. There's a very constrained number of ways that we can orient ourselves in the world. And they boil down to, I would say, a set of fundamental ethical axioms. But one of them is that the individual is sovereign and paramount, and that everybody has intrinsic value, and that you set up their societies with that as the fundamental axiom, and then it works. So I think the moral relativism claim, it's like, no, I'm sorry, that's wrong. That's wrong. And, if you're not convinced of that, because you might not be, and perhaps you shouldn't be, you might also avail yourself of the relevant animal literature, because some of the most brilliant people whose work I've encountered, Franz de Waal, for example, who's a primatologist, and Jaak Panksepp, who was probably the world's foremost neuroscientist of emotions, both studied the emergence of morality in rats, that was Panksepp, and in chimpanzees, that was de Waal, and demonstrated quite clearly with the chimps. It's particularly interesting that brutal chimp dominance hierarchies that are predicated only on power. So that would be the chimp patriarchy, right? That would be the Marxist view. I'm serious. I'm really serious about that. That would be the chimp patriarchy. That's the view of the world. Every hierarchy is brutal and it's dominated by a tyrant. And those who climb to the top do that because they're tyrannical. De Waal demonstrated quite clearly that those hierarchies, even among chimps, are very unstable, and the people and the chimps who run them are very likely to meet an extraordinarily violent end. And so he showed that form of hierarchical organization was radically unstable. And it's not surprising, right? Because even chimps don't like to be tyrannized. So, and they will rebel eventually as a consequence. And so you can see this emergent ethic far below the level of the human. And Jaak Panksepp, and this is something, he should have won a Nobel Prize, that guy. He was an absolute genius. He was the person who identified the play circuit in mammals. That's a big deal. They have to find that, that our capacity for play is actually a consequence of a separate biological system. That's a major discovery. And he spent a lot of time studying play behavior among rats, rough and tumble play in particular, which is a very interesting field of endeavor, because fathers tend to do a lot of rough and tumble play with their kids, and it seems to be one of the primary ways that human fathers socialize their children, and so it's very relevant. What Panksepp found was that rats would work to earn the right to engage in rough and tumble play, and so that's how you tell if an animal is motivated. You see if it'll work for something. It's kind of the same way you figure out if a human being is motivated. And rats will work to enter an arena where they know they'll be able to wrestle with another rat, especially if they're young, juveniles, especially if they're juvenile males. And if you pair two rats together, and one of them is 10% bigger than the other, the big rat can stomp the hell out of the little rat consistently. And so then imagine you did your experiment, you just paired them once, and the big rat stomped the little rat, and you say, ha! Dominance hierarchies are predicated on power. That'd be your conclusion. It's like, yeah, except you missed something. And what you missed is you don't play with someone once. You play with them over and over and over and over. And the rules that govern a game that continues across a large segment of time are not the same rules that govern a game you only play once. Because if you're playing, imagine you're not playing a game, you're playing a set of games. And then imagine that the rules for winning a set of games are not the same rules for winning one game.